we will start a discussion of Ranis-Fei model, which was developed by the economist Ranis-Fei in the year 1961. And this model can be thought of as an extension of the Lewis model. But the Lewis model undermines the role of agriculture in boosting the growth of industrial sector and does not acknowledge the fact that increase in productivity of labor should take place prior to the labor shift between the two sectors. These two ideas were taken into account in this dual economic model, which shows the entire process in three stages. So this model, as given in the book by Debraj Rai, is being discussed now. In the traditional agricultural sector, there is disguised unemployment and the wage rate is given by income sharing. That is, we learned that when we discussed about disguised unemployment, that here people get their return in terms of average product and not marginal product. As usual, the industrial sector is assumed to be a capitalistic sector. Economic development proceeds by transfer of labor from agriculture to industry and the simultaneous transfer of surplus food grains production, which sustains that part of the labor force engaged in non-agricultural activity. Now we go to the diagrammatic presentation straight away. Now these lower two panels show the agricultural sector. Now in each panel of the diagram, the industrial labor force read from left to right, whereas the agricultural labor force is read from right to left. Assume for simplicity that the total labor force is divided into agriculture and industry. This entire labor force will be divided into agriculture and industry, which implies that the width of the panels correspond to the entire labor force in the economy. Now we begin with this lowest panel. In the lowest panel, a typical agricultural production function is drawn. This is our typical production function. The production function levels off and there is a phase of surplus labor here. The average wage is just, which is proportional to the angle. So this is the total output, this is the total labor force. So this is this by this is the average wage. If wages in this sector are decided by income sharing, then the average wages is just, which is proportional to the angle shown in this panel. This turns out to be the wage in the industrial sector, which has not yet developed fully. Thus, the segment BC, which is the segment, this segment BC has no surplus labor. So here we have surplus labor, here we do not have surplus labor. But here what we have disguised unemployment. That implies that though there is the marginal product of labor is not zero, but marginal product of labor is less than the average product of labor. So, to the right of point C, the phase of disguised unemployment ends. So, we have three phases. Here, surplus labor. This beach C is the phase of disguised unemployment, and this is the phase which we will come to know is the phase of commercialized agriculture. We begin with the entire labor force in agriculture. Suppose we decrease this by a small amount so that we are still in the surplus labor phase, then the total wage bill of the agricultural sector falls along this diagonal line. The wage in the agricultural sector does not rise and output does not fall because we are in the surplus labor region. Now, what happens? After this point, we no, here only there is a surplus opening up here. That means our total product is given by this horizontal straight line and the wage bill is given by this. So this difference is the amount of surplus generated in the agricultural sector. If we move labor from this sector to somewhere else, the agricultural surplus opens up, and this is given by the vertical gap between the production and wage bill line. If we divide this surplus by the number of transferred workers, মানে ওই সারপ্লাস কে ডিভাইড করছি যারা এখান থেকে চলে গেল সেই তাদের দিয়ে. So if we divide this surplus by the number of transferred workers, then we obtain the average agricultural surplus, where we are taking the average of per capita surplus amount relative to the transferred workers. It is easy to see that average agricultural surplus in the surplus labor phase must be exactly equal to W bar. What is W bar? We have already noted this by this. This is represented here as a horizontal straight line because this does not change. In the region of surplus labor, it remains at W bar. So what we have noted here, that if we move labor from this surplus region, from rural sector, an agricultural surplus is generated, and it is shown by the vertical distance between this production function and this wage line. So what we are trying to say here is the imagery of NERCS of 1953 that we discussed in our lecture on disguised unemployment. That is, it is as if each labor simply moved out of agriculture with his food parcel on his back. The average surplus is depicted in this panel. Average surplus is equal to W bar here and is unchanging in the surplus labor phase. This is depicted by this horizontal line W bar. Now we observe that each transferred laborer in industry must be able to buy back his food parcel because he is no longer employed in the agricultural sector but in industry. So the person who is moving out must be able to buy back his food, otherwise he cannot survive in the industrial sector. This means that the minimum industrial wage required to do this, which is depicted in, say, in this panel as W star. Now, this is required for the industrial worker to survive in the urban sector. The industrial wage is described in units of industrial goods. It implies that we multiply W bar by the relative price or terms of trade between agriculture and industry to arrive at the required minimum industrial wage, which is equal to W star. This is exactly not equal to this, but this is W bar into the terms of trade between agriculture and industry. In the surplus labor phase, that is in this phase, the minimum industrial wage required for compensation does not change because the average agricultural surplus is not changing. Average agricultural surplus is remaining the same, so there is no change. This creates a perfectly elastic labor supply curve in this phase. This is a horizontal line emanating from this point, W star. The zone where it is possible to have economic development with unlimited supplies of labor, which implies an expansion in the industrial sector, does not drive its wage up. So this is a phase of unlimited supplies of labor. Here we have we have surplus labor existing or unlimited supplies of labor. So industrial development can take place without increasing the wage rate. Now we move to the region of disguised unemployment. What does it imply? The average agricultural surplus begins to decline. Now, for the, note that we have to go here. Here, what is happening? This is a straight line. This has no change. But what is happening here is that the average agricultural surplus is beginning to decline because total output in the agricultural sector is beginning to fall. And those who are still there continue to consume the same amount of per capita output. This is shown by the decreasing line in the zone B dash C dash. Here, the surplus is declining. Right. If the wage in the industry is still W star as before, now we move on to the industry curve graph again. If this is still W star as before, transferred workers will not be able to compensate themselves for the move because it is physically not possible for each of them to buy W bar units of food as the average agricultural surplus has fallen below W bar. Since there is no surplus labor, what we find here is that the people who have moved to the industrial sector are no longer able to survive with W bar because it is physically not possible for each of them to buy W bar units of food as the average agricultural surplus has fallen below W bar. What does it mean? It means food prices start to rise. This implies that terms of trade between rural and urban sectors begin to move against industry. This means, or this leads to the compensation for this price effect is essential, and the industrial wage must rise. That is, we can no longer have this wage, but the industrial wage has to rise. However, rising wages cannot solve the problem. No matter how much the industrial wages rise, it is not possible for workers to buy their food, old food parcel pack, because there is simply not enough of food available. The only way that compensation can be achieved is that for industrial workers to consume a mix of agricultural and industrial products, the latter, or the industrial products, compensating for the lack of agricultural products. Now, is such a compensation possible? It depends on how close the traditional wage is to the subsistence wage. What does it imply? It implies that the closer W bar, or the subsistence wage, W bar is to the subsistence wage, the larger is the compensation required, and steeper is the increase in the required industrial wage. Conversely, the easier it is to substitute industrial consumption for agricultural consumption, the softer is the necessary increase in the compensatory industrial wage. Now, Ranis-Fei referred to this phase where the supply wage of labor tilts upward as the first turning point. So here we have the first turning point. You must be remembering that we discussed about the turning point of the Lewis model, where the industrial and the agricultural sector move in tandem, both become modern sectors. But here we have two turning points. This is a turning point where the industrial wages begin to rise. Now we continue the transfer of labor until we reach point C. Yeah. We continue with the transfer. At this point, disguised unemployment comes to an end. The marginal product of labor begins to exceed the traditionally given wage rate. It implies that it becomes profitable to actively bid for labor because additional contribution of labor in agricultural production exceeds the cost of hiring labor. This leads to a rise in agricultural wages. Wage bill falls more slowly than it did before along the diagonal line. It now traces the curve after C, where wages rise as the agricultural labor force decreases. This phenomenon is may be thought of as the commercialization of agriculture and is associated with an even steeper decrease in agricultural surplus. in terms of the industrial sector, what do we find? There is a much steeper rise in the wage rate here. This is the stage of surplus labor. This is the stage of disguised unemployment. Here we have, from here, we have a commercialized agricultural sector. So this is our first turning point, and this is our second turning point. So this completes the construction of the supply curve. Here, first horizontal, then somewhat steep, then a sharp rise. We are now ready to see how the model works. The industrial sector demands labor for production. Now we have a family of demand curves. We start with the lowest one. It is a known curve, and we get the equilibrium where this demand curve intersects this wage line or supply curve, and we get the amount of employment as X. And this X amount of labor is hired at wage rate W star. Now with industrial production, profits are realized, this much of profit realized, parts of which are plowed back as extra capital in the industrial sector. This part of the story is very similar to the Harrod-Domar and Solow paradigms. The expansion of capital implies that the demand curve shifts. Demand for labor rises because the economy is in the surplus labor phase. This labor is forthcoming from the traditional sector with no increase in wage. So here we are employing more labor, but the wage remains at W star. Industrial employment is now at Y. With further investment, the demand curve for labor shifts to a point where compensatory wage may rise. That is, we have shifted our demand curve to this curve, but our supply curve is also rising. So the employment is Z. It rises from, say, Y to Z. However, it would have risen even further to, say, point Z dash if our wage would have been fixed at this level. So this would have intersected this marginal product or demand curve at this point, and we could have got the employment level at Z dash. This happens because, or rather this cannot happen because we have crossed this turning point here and we have moved this side, that is beyond B dash or B double dash or B dash or B in the lowest panel. The fall in agricultural surplus chokes off industrial employment to some extent, because we could have had employment up till here, but now we have employment up till this point. So the fall in agricultural surplus chokes off industrial employment because it raises the cost of hiring industrial labor. Now we have more or less completed the model. But we need to mention some other things too. Capital accumulation in the industrial sector is the engine of growth. That means more capital implies a great demand for labor. That leads to greater rural-urban migration, which in turn leads to the terms of trade gradually turning against industry, which implies food prices rise because a smaller number of farmers must support a greater number of non-agricultural workers, and this leads to an increase in the industrial wage. The pace of development is driven by the accumulation of capital, but is limited by the ability of the economy to produce surplus food. So, and on the one hand, we have that the pace of development is driven by capital accumulation, but on the other, it is limited by the ability of the economy to produce a surplus of food. This is the heart of Louis Ranis-Fei story. The development proceeds via the joint transfer of labor and agricultural surplus from the traditional agricultural sector to the modern industrial sector. The ability to expand the industrial sector is determined in part by production conditions in agriculture. In particular, without the existence of a surplus in the agricultural sector, it is difficult to create growth in the industrial sector. So this completes our model of Ranis and Fei. Hope you have understood. If it's not clear, I'll provide the handout and you can go through the diagram and what is written over there. And I think you'll be able to understand that it is not very difficult. It appears to be complicated, but it is not very difficult. Now we come to policy issues. Always remember in mind, anything you do in economics must involve certain policy issues. Without policy implications, nothing has any value. So here we deal with two things. Firstly, we will talk about agricultural taxation. Now, the assumption that the wage rate in agriculture is fixed until the phase of commercialization is reached is very strong. A labor is progressively withdrawn from the agricultural sector, leading to more income left for the remaining workers to share. If they share it, there are two effects. Now, imagine what we are saying, not illogical. People who remain or are left back in the land, they have more production at hand. They have more output at their hand. And they may have a tendency to consume more than before. Now, if they share it, there are two effects. The agricultural surplus available to industry is reduced, and the compensating wage paid to transferred workers must rise even in the face of surplus labor, which implies that the surplus labor curve to industry fails to be perfectly elastic. So this observation uncovers a problematic issue in the Louis, Ranis and Fei theory. Now, the industry has vested interest in taxing agricultural sector because it is only through taxation that the incomes of family farmers stay low as labor is withdrawn. If taxes are not imposed, agricultural income will increase, which will lead to industrial wage increase. Industrial wages rise. This keeps migration incentives alive. but it chokes off the industrial profit. The source of tension between agriculture and industry develops. What does all this imply? Industrialists would support agricultural taxation. But industrial workers, they would not support such taxes because it would raise migration and increase the competition for jobs. What about small farmers? Small farmers would never support this as they are the ones who are taxed. Now, coming to large landowners, the situation is a bit complicated. Their response depends on the intensity of taxation and the ease with which some of it can be evaded. Certainly, they prefer no taxation to taxation, but taxation also has the effect of driving down rural wages. To the extent that large landowners are significant employers of labor, this effect may be beneficial. Thus, we see that a policy of agrarian taxation may run into several severe political problems, even though it may have a beneficial on industrial. However, the assumption that agricultural taxation does not assist in industrial development is a short-sighted view. There are longer-term considerations. If farmers believe that greater output will be systematically taxed away, then they will lose all incentives to create, improve, or maintain productive inputs such as irrigation facilities or soil quality. There will be underinvestment in agriculture, and this underinvestment will have repercussions for availability of future surplus. This is all we had to say about agricultural taxation. Now we come to agricultural pricing policy. This is a second policy issue. Now, food can be coaxed instead of coerced into the market by lucrative prices for output or subsidies to agricultural inputs. A higher output price is more costly route to industrial capitalists, and every concession to agriculture has repercussions for the industrial wage, either directly as an increase in agrarian income or indirectly via higher relative price of food. The typical price support program consists in offering guaranteed procurement prices at which the government stands ready to buy food. The idea is to increase marketed surplus of grain. At the same time, governments are often unwilling to pass on these prices to urban consumers, partly because these consumers are typically incensed by higher prices and partly because of the effect on the industrial wages. It implies that price support programs are usually accompanied by a subsidy to urban consumers. What does it mean? It means that the procured food is sold at or below market prices by the government. Of course, someone has to pay for this subsidy, and it usually comes out of the government budget. An alternative to high procurement price is the policy of keeping input prices low. That is, water, electricity, and fertilizer may be supplied free or at reduced prices. In India, the fertilizer subsidy alone accounted for an enormous chunk of the government budget. In the late 1980s, the size of the subsidy exceeded total revenues from non-corporate income taxes. Another option is to maintain an overvalued exchange rate. The overvaluation is kept in place by tariff or quota-based restrictions on imports. An overhead exchange rate serves many purposes, and one implication is that the price of exports are kept artificially low in terms of the domestic currency. What does it imply? If the if the country is a food exporter, this policy has the effect of discouraging food exports and shifting food sales into the domestic market. The policy has sufficient opacity about it. That means it is not clear. Farmers may not be aware that the exchange rate is overvalued and reduces the export earnings. And it has the desired impact of making food available to urban consumers without a price rise. But it is important to note that policies such as export restrictions do involve serious efficiency losses and can run the country into severe balance of payments problem. Moreover, if there is a sudden liberalization of exchange rate, the opacity of the policy may just as quickly disappear and be replaced with a more transparent policy of an outright ban on food exports. The Indian government has faced this dilemma in the 1990s. Perhaps there is no way out but to endure the short-run rise in food prices and the inherent shift in national income in favor of agriculture, with the understanding that this will be good for the entire economy in the longer run. So here we come to the end of our discussion of Ranis-Fei model, which may be called the Lewis Ranis-Fei model. Here we have discussed the model and raised some policy issues. Do you have any questions?